The billionaire CEO had no idea that the last employee left in his building every night was a single mother trying not to fall apart. At 2:13 in the morning, the 43rd floor of Blake Dynamics was almost completely dark except for one small corner office near the windows overlooking downtown Chicago. Rows of expensive monitors had already gone black hours ago, and the cleaning crew had finished their rounds nearly 30 minutes earlier, but Emily Carter was still sitting at her desk with tired eyes fixed on her laptop screen. The cold light from the computer reflected across her face as she quietly rubbed her temple and exhaled. Her coffee had gone cold almost 3 hours ago. Beside her keyboard sat a folded drawing made with crayons, the edges slightly wrinkled from being carried around all day inside her purse. It showed a smiling stick figure holding hands with a little girl under a bright yellow sun. Across the top, in messy handwriting, were the words, "My mommy is my hero." Emily glanced at the drawing for half a second before forcing herself to continue typing. Her deadline was 9 o'clock the next morning, and if this proposal failed, she knew exactly what would happen. Blake Dynamics didn't keep employees who couldn't keep up, especially not assistants from lower management with too many absences on record and overdue daycare payments. Outside the windows, rain tapped softly against the glass, while downtown traffic slowly disappeared below. Emily checked the time again and immediately felt panic twist inside her chest. Sophie's babysitter charged extra after midnight, and Emily already owed her nearly $200 from the previous month. She quickly saved her files, shoved papers into her worn canvas bag, and stood too fast, making herself slightly dizzy. 12-hour workdays had become normal months ago. Some nights, she skipped dinner so Sophie could have enough groceries for school lunches. Other nights, she sat in the parking lot crying quietly before driving home because she didn't want her daughter to see how exhausted she really was. But tomorrow mattered too much to break down now. She grabbed her coat and hurried toward the elevators without noticing the silver laptop still sitting open on her desk. Downstairs in the private executive parking level, Ethan Blake had just stepped out of a late board meeting that had dragged on for almost 4 hours. At 39 years old, the founder and billionaire CEO of Blake Dynamics had become one of the youngest tech moguls in the country, but tonight he looked more exhausted than successful. His tie hung loose around his collar, and faint shadows sat beneath his eyes as he walked toward his office elevator while scrolling through financial reports on his phone. Most employees rarely saw him in person. Rumors around the company described him as cold, impossible to impress, and married to his work. Ethan preferred it that way. Human connection complicated things. As he entered the executive elevator, a security monitor near the desk caught his attention. One camera still showed movement upstairs. Ethan frowned slightly. "Who's still here?" he asked the night guard. The older man adjusted his glasses before checking the screen. "Looks like Emily Carter from operations, sir. She stays late pretty often." Ethan glanced at the monitor again. On the grainy black and white screen, he watched a woman quietly leave the office floor alone while carrying a cheap canvas bag over her shoulder. Her posture looked exhausted, but she still paused near the elevators to turn off unnecessary lights before disappearing from view. Ethan didn't know why, but something about that moment made him stop walking. "Emily Carter," he repeated quietly, almost to himself. Then the elevator doors closed in front of him while rain continued pouring outside the tower. And somewhere across the city, Emily still had no idea she had just left the most important thing she owned sitting alone on her desk. By the time Emily finally parked outside her apartment building, the rain had become heavier, turning the cracked pavement into shallow pools of water that reflected the orange streetlights. She sat inside her 10-year-old Honda for a moment with both hands still gripping the steering wheel, trying to gather enough energy to walk upstairs. Her back hurt, her eyes burned from staring at spreadsheets all night, and her stomach reminded her she had not eaten since a vending machine granola bar at noon. But none of that mattered as much as getting home to Sophie. Emily grabbed her bag and hurried through the rain toward the apartment entrance, shielding her face with one hand while cold water soaked through the sleeves of her coat. The building elevator had been broken for almost 2 weeks, so she climbed 3 flights of stairs quietly, careful not to wake the neighbors whose complaints about noise had become increasingly less patient over the months. When she unlocked the apartment door, the familiar scent of laundry detergent and canned tomato soup greeted her immediately. The apartment was small enough that Emily could see almost everything from the doorway. Sophie was asleep on the couch beneath a pink blanket, still wearing the tiny pair of socks covered in cartoon stars she loved so much. A children's movie menu played silently on the old television while a lamp in the corner cast soft yellow light across the room. Emily's chest tightened with guilt the second she saw her daughter curled up waiting for her. "I am sorry, baby," she whispered even though Sophie could not hear her. The babysitter, Mrs. Ramirez, emerged quietly from the kitchenette while putting on her coat. "She tried to stay awake for you," the older woman said gently. "She made you a picture." Emily smiled weakly and nodded. "Thank you for staying late again." Mrs. Ramirez hesitated for a second before speaking carefully. "Emily, the landlord came by earlier. He said the rent needs to be paid by Friday this time." Emily lowered her eyes immediately. "I know. I just do not want you worrying alone." Emily forced another smile, even though embarrassment burned across her face. "I will figure it out." After the babysitter left, Emily finally kicked off her wet shoes and walked toward the tiny kitchen table to unpack her things for tomorrow. She pulled out folders, pens, Sophie's drawing, and a half-empty bottle of aspirin before suddenly freezing completely. Her heart dropped so fast it almost hurt. The laptop was not there. Emily immediately searched through the bag again, panic rising with every second. She checked the couch, the kitchen counter, even the passenger seat keys still in her hand, as though the computer might magically appear somewhere else. But deep down she already knew the truth. "No, no, no, no," she whispered breathlessly. She had left it at the office. Emily pressed both hands against her forehead, while terror spread through her entire body. The proposal presentation for tomorrow morning was stored inside that laptop along with months of reports she had not backed up yet. If someone misplaced it, damaged it, or reported it missing before she recovered it, there was a real chance she could lose her job. And losing her job did not just mean embarrassment. It meant no rent, no groceries, no daycare, no way to take care of Sophie. Emily looked at the clock on the microwave. 2:47 a.m. The office tower would already be locked down for the night, and she barely had enough gas left in her car to drive back downtown. Her breathing became shaky as she stared at her sleeping daughter across the room. Sophie shifted slightly beneath the blanket before mumbling sleepily, "Mommy." Emily immediately softened her voice. "I am here, sweetheart." Sophie opened her eyes halfway and smiled tiredly. "Did you finish your big work thing?" Emily felt tears sting her eyes, but she forced herself to smile back. "Not yet, baby." Then her phone suddenly vibrated on the kitchen table, and when Emily looked down at the screen, she saw a private company number she did not recognize calling her at nearly 3 o'clock in the morning. Emily stared at the unknown company number vibrating across her cracked phone screen while her pulse pounded in her ears. For one terrifying second, she thought security had already found the missing laptop and reported it to management. Her hands felt cold as she answered the call carefully, trying not to wake Sophie again. "Hello." There was a brief silence on the other end before a calm male voice responded. "Emily Carter?" The voice sounded deep, controlled, and strangely familiar. "Yes," she answered quietly. "This is Ethan Blake." Emily nearly stopped breathing. Her eyes widened instantly as she gripped the edge of the kitchen table for balance. Even employees who had never met him recognized his voice from company meetings and online interviews. The billionaire founder of Blake Dynamics was the last person she ever expected to call her directly at 3 in the morning. "Mr. Blake," she said quickly, panic immediately creeping into her tone. "I am so sorry about the laptop. I realized just now, and I can come back immediately to get it. I swear this has never happened before." Ethan remained silent for a second, as though surprised by how frightened she sounded. Behind him, she could hear the faint hum of a car engine and rain tapping softly against glass. "You left after almost 14 hours in the office," he said evenly. "I do not think anyone functions perfectly at 2 in the morning." Emily did not know what to say to that. She felt embarrassed enough already without the chief executive officer personally witnessing her mistake. "I understand if this becomes a formal report," she said quietly. "The proposal is still complete. I can be there in 30 minutes. Ethan glanced toward the laptop sitting on the passenger seat beside him. The screen had gone dark hours ago, but he still remembered seeing her name glowing across the login screen while security carried it downstairs. "Emily Carter, Operations Support." 31 years old. Emergency contact listed as Sophie Carter. No spouse listed. During the drive, curiosity had pushed him to open her employee profile longer than he normally would have. Not because of the mistake, because of the camera footage. Something about the way she shut off the office lights before leaving had stayed in his mind. Most people rushed out of the building without caring about anything except themselves. But she had paused to take care of a workplace that barely noticed her existence. Ethan spent years surrounded by ambitious executives who constantly demanded more money, more status, more influence. Yet somehow the exhausted woman from operations who quietly worked until 2 in the morning felt more real than anyone he had spoken to all week. "You do not need to come downtown," he finally said. Emily blinked in confusion. "What? I already have the laptop." She frowned slightly, trying to process his words. "You have it." Ethan adjusted one hand on the steering wheel while waiting at a red light. "Security brought it to me before I left." Emily's stomach twisted tighter. "I am really sorry for causing trouble, Mr. Blake. You have apologized 4 times in less than 60 seconds. His tone remained calm, but there was the faintest hint of amusement underneath it. Emily lowered her eyes immediately, embarrassed again. In the background, Sophie shifted beneath the blanket and murmured softly in her sleep. Ethan heard it through the phone. "Your daughter?" he asked before thinking about why he even cared. Emily hesitated briefly. "Yes. She fell asleep waiting for me." For some reason, that sentence settled heavily inside the quiet space of his car. Ethan looked through the windshield at the rain-covered streets of Chicago while expensive skyscrapers reflected across the wet pavement around him. He suddenly imagined a little girl asleep on a couch somewhere while her mother worked herself past exhaustion inside his company building. "What is your address?" he asked calmly. Emily froze. "My address? I am already driving." Her heart skipped instantly. "Driving where?" Ethan's voice stayed steady and simple. "To bring your laptop back." Emily stood frozen in the middle of her tiny kitchen long after the phone call ended, staring at the dark screen in disbelief. Her billionaire chief executive officer was personally driving through downtown Chicago in the middle of the night to return her forgotten laptop. The entire situation felt unreal. Men like Ethan Blake existed on magazine covers, business podcasts, and giant digital billboards above the financial district. They did not show up at old apartment buildings carrying laptops for exhausted employees from operations. Emily looked around her apartment with rising panic. Dirty dishes sat drying beside the sink. Unfolded laundry rested on a chair near the hallway, and Sophie's crayons were scattered across the coffee table beside unpaid utility bills. She quickly gathered the papers into a drawer and folded the blanket on the couch while trying not to wake her daughter. Outside, headlights briefly flashed across the rain-covered windows as another car passed the building. Emily checked the clock again. Nearly 3:15 in the morning. Her nerves tightened with every second. A part of her wondered if this was some kind of test. Another part of her could not stop thinking about how calm Ethan's voice had sounded on the phone. No anger, no impatience, just quiet certainty. 10 minutes later, bright headlights slowly pulled into the parking lot outside the apartment complex. Emily carefully peeked through the blinds and immediately recognized the sleek black Mercedes sedan from company photographs online. Her stomach dropped. "Oh my God," she whispered under her breath. She quickly smoothed down her hair and looked at her reflection in the microwave door, suddenly painfully aware of how tired she looked. Her oversized sweatshirt still had a small stain near the sleeve, and there were faint dark circles beneath her eyes from weeks of poor sleep. Before she could panic further, a gentle knock sounded at the apartment door. Emily inhaled nervously and opened it. Ethan Blake stood beneath the dim hallway light, holding her silver laptop case in one hand, while rainwater still glistened across the shoulders of his dark coat. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Seeing him in person outside the office felt strangely different. At work, he always seemed untouchable, surrounded by glass conference rooms, security teams, and executives in expensive suits. Here, standing in the narrow hallway of her aging apartment building at 3 in the morning, he suddenly looked less like a billionaire and more like a man who was simply tired. Emily immediately stepped aside awkwardly. "Mr. Blake, you really did not have to do this." Ethan handed her the laptop carefully. "You said the presentation mattered." His eyes briefly shifted past her shoulder toward the apartment interior, before returning politely to her face. Emily accepted the laptop with both hands like it was something fragile. Thank you. Seriously, you probably saved my job tonight. Ethan studied her quietly for a second. Up close, he could see exhaustion written all over her expression. Not laziness, not carelessness. The kind of exhaustion that came from carrying too much responsibility for too long without help. Do you always stay that late at the office? He asked. Emily gave a small, embarrassed laugh. Only when I cannot afford to fall behind. The honesty in her answer caught him off guard. Most employees spoke carefully around him, constantly filtering themselves to sound impressive or strategic. Emily sounded too tired to pretend. Before Ethan could respond, a tiny voice suddenly drifted from inside the apartment. Mommy. Emily turned immediately. Sophie stood near the couch rubbing one sleepy eye while holding her stuffed rabbit against her chest. Her blonde hair was messy from sleep, and she blinked curiously toward the tall stranger standing at the doorway. I am sorry, baby, Emily said softly. Did we wake you? Sophie looked directly at Ethan for several quiet seconds. Most adults became uncomfortable under the intense curiosity children naturally carried, but Ethan simply waited. Then Sophie tilted her head slightly and asked in a sleepy voice, Are you the man from Mommy's office? Emily's face turned red instantly. Sophie. But Ethan surprised her by kneeling slightly, so he would not seem intimidating to the little girl. I guess I am, he answered gently. Sophie looked at the laptop in Emily's hands before smiling softly. Then thank you for helping my mommy. And for reasons Ethan could not fully explain yet, those simple words affected him more than any business award he had received in years. For a moment, the small apartment became completely quiet except for the sound of rain against the windows and the distant hum of traffic outside. Ethan remained crouched slightly near the doorway while Sophie stared at him with sleepy curiosity, still clutching her stuffed rabbit tightly against her chest. Emily felt strangely nervous watching the interaction unfold. Most people became uncomfortable around children they did not know, especially men as powerful and polished as Ethan Blake. But instead of pulling away or awkwardly forcing conversation, Ethan simply offered Sophie a small smile. You should probably be asleep right now, he said gently. Sophie shrugged in the serious way only children could. I tried, but Mommy works late a lot. Emily immediately looked embarrassed. Sophie, what? The little girl asked innocently. It is true. Ethan slowly stood again, but his expression changed slightly after hearing those words. His eyes drifted around the apartment more carefully this time. The place was clean despite its age, but there were signs of struggle everywhere once you noticed them. The couch had a small tier near one armrest that had been stitched together by hand. The kitchen table held a stack of overdue bills partially hidden beneath Sophie's coloring books. A grocery list sat beside the refrigerator with nearly every item crossed out except milk and eggs. Even the apartment itself carried a quiet kind of exhaustion, like someone was constantly trying to hold everything together with just enough effort to survive another week. Ethan had spent most of his adult life inside luxury high-rises, private airports, and executive boardrooms where problems disappeared the moment money touched them. Standing here now felt uncomfortably grounding. Emily noticed him glance toward the nearly empty kitchen and immediately folded her arms self-consciously. I know it is not exactly impressive, she said quietly. Ethan looked back at her. You think I came here to judge your apartment? Emily gave a tired little laugh. Most wealthy people do. Something in her honesty made him pause again. Ethan was used to people filtering themselves around him, carefully performing versions of politeness or admiration. Emily did not seem interested in impressing him anymore. She looked too exhausted for that. Sophie suddenly walked closer and tugged lightly on Ethan's coat sleeve. You are taller than the people on TV, she announced seriously. Emily nearly covered her face in embarrassment. I am so sorry. But Ethan surprised her again with a quiet laugh under his breath. That might be the nicest thing anyone has said to me this month. Sophie smiled proudly at his answer. Then her eyes drifted toward the rain outside the hallway window. Did you drive all the way here by yourself? I did. In the rain? Apparently. Sophie looked genuinely impressed. Mommy hates driving in rain. Emily sighed softly. Thank you, Sophie. Ethan glanced at the little girl again before asking, How old are you? 7. But I will be 8 after Christmas. He nodded slightly. That is an important age. Sophie held up the stuffed rabbit. His name is Pickles. Ethan looked at the toy with complete seriousness. That is a strong name. Sophie giggled immediately, and the sound caught him off guard in a way he did not expect. It had been years since laughter inside a home sounded familiar to him. His penthouse downtown was silent almost every night except for conference calls and financial news playing in the background. Expensive, beautiful, empty. Emily noticed the subtle shift in his expression before quickly looking away. Something about seeing Ethan Blake standing inside her tiny apartment felt deeply strange. At the office, people treated him like he was untouchable, almost intimidating. Here, with rainwater still darkening the shoulders of his coat while her daughter chatted with him beside a broken couch, he suddenly seemed less distant than she ever imagined. Then the lights above the kitchen flickered once. Emily's stomach tightened immediately. The electricity bill. She prayed silently the power would not shut off tonight of all nights. Ethan noticed her expression change instantly. Everything okay? Emily forced a smile too quickly. Yeah, the building wiring is old. But before Ethan could respond, the apartment lights flickered a second time, longer now, and Sophie looked up nervously toward the ceiling while Emily quietly realized she had exactly $43 left in her checking account. The lights steadied again after a few tense seconds, but Emily still felt her embarrassment sitting heavily in the room. She quickly looked away from Ethan, pretending to adjust papers on the kitchen counter while hoping he had not noticed the panic on her face. But Ethan noticed everything. Years of running a billion-dollar company had trained him to read silence just as carefully as words. The flickering lights, the overdue bills half hidden beneath children's drawings, the nearly empty refrigerator, the way Emily instinctively apologized for things that were not really mistakes. None of it matched the polished corporate image most people tried to present at Blake Dynamics. Yet somehow, this felt more honest than any executive meeting he had attended in years. Sophie climbed back onto the couch and patted the empty spot beside her. You can sit if you want, she offered casually to Ethan, as though inviting billionaires into small apartments at 3:30 in the morning happened every day. Emily immediately shook her head. Sweetheart, Mr. Blake probably needs to get home. But Ethan surprised her again. I can stay for a minute. Emily blinked in disbelief as he carefully removed his coat and folded it over one arm before sitting on the far edge of the couch beside Sophie. The entire image felt impossible. Ethan Blake, whose face appeared on business magazine covers beside headlines about billion-dollar mergers, now sat beneath a flickering apartment lamp while a 7-year-old girl showed him stuffed animals. Sophie proudly held up Pickles the rabbit. He has only one eye now because our dog chewed him. You have a dog too? Ethan asked. Not anymore, Sophie answered quietly. We had to give him to another family after Mommy's car broke. Emily lowered her eyes immediately. Ethan glanced toward her, but she avoided his gaze. He understood enough not to ask more questions. Sophie then reached for a stack of drawings beside the couch and spread them across the cushion between them. These are mine, she explained proudly. Ethan picked one up carefully. It showed a little girl holding hands with a woman under a giant yellow sun, almost identical to the drawing Emily kept at work. This one is my favorite, Sophie said. That is Mommy. Ethan studied the crayon drawing longer than expected. You made her very tall. Sophie nodded seriously. Because she does everything. The simple sentence landed harder than either Emily or Ethan expected. Emily suddenly became very interested in reorganizing pencils on the kitchen counter so nobody would notice the emotion in her face. Ethan looked at the little girl beside him, then toward the exhausted woman quietly trying to hold her life together 10 feet away. Something uncomfortable shifted inside him. He had spent years building a company worth billions of dollars. Thousands of employees worked under him every day, yet he realized he barely understood what their real lives looked like after they left the office. To him, late hours were strategy, competition, success. But for Emily, every extra hour at work was connected directly to rent, groceries, childcare, and survival. Sophie tilted her head suddenly. Why are you working so late too? She asked him. Ethan leaned back slightly, caught off guard by the question. Adults usually avoided asking him personal things. I guess I work a lot, he answered. But why? She pressed innocently. You already own the company. Emily almost interrupted from embarrassment, but Ethan quietly raised one hand to stop her. For some reason, he wanted to hear this conversation continue. Sophie looked genuinely confused. Mommy works because we need money. But you already have money. Ethan stared at her for a moment before unexpectedly laughing softly under his breath. Not because the question was funny, but because nobody had ever reduced his entire life down to such a simple truth before. That is actually a very good question, he admitted quietly. Sophie smiled proudly while Emily finally looked toward him again. And for the first time since Ethan Blake built his empire, sitting inside a tiny apartment with flickering lights and a tired single mother nearby, he found himself unable to come up with an answer that made any real sense. By the time Ethan finally stood to leave, the rain outside had softened into a quiet drizzle, but the strange warmth inside the apartment lingered in ways none of them fully understood yet. Sophie was already half asleep again on the couch, curled beneath her blanket with pickles tucked under her chin. Before Ethan reached the door, she opened one sleepy eye and mumbled, "Good night, Mr. Tall Guy." Emily covered her mouth to hide an embarrassed laugh, while Ethan glanced back toward the couch with the faintest smile. "Good night, Sophie." Then he looked toward Emily as she walked him to the hallway. For a second, neither of them spoke. The narrow apartment corridor suddenly felt oddly quiet after the unexpected ease of the last 20 minutes. Emily tightened her grip slightly around the laptop against her chest. "I still cannot believe you drove all the way here for this." Ethan slipped his coat back on slowly. "You said the presentation mattered. Most people at your level would have told security to handle it. Most people at my level probably should sleep more too." Emily smiled softly before she could stop herself. It was the first genuine smile Ethan had seen from her all night, and somehow it changed her entire face. Less exhausted. Younger. Warmer. For a brief second, he caught himself staring slightly too long before clearing his throat. "You should get some rest, Emily. You have a big morning ahead of you." She nodded quietly. "Thank you again." "Really?" Ethan gave a small nod and finally turned toward the stairs. Emily watched him disappear down the hallway, still struggling to process that one of the richest men in Chicago had just sat in her apartment listening to her daughter explain why stuffed rabbits only needed one eye to be loved. The moment the building door closed downstairs, Emily leaned back against her apartment wall and exhaled slowly. Her entire life felt strange tonight, as though something invisible had shifted without warning. The next morning, Blake Dynamics buzzed with its usual fast-moving energy by 8:30. Expensive shoes crossed polished marble floors while assistants rushed between elevators carrying coffee and presentation folders. Emily stepped into the building feeling more exhausted than ever after barely sleeping 3 hours, but she forced herself to focus on work. She told herself repeatedly that last night meant nothing beyond simple kindness. Ethan Blake was her chief executive officer. Men like him existed in completely different worlds. But the second she entered the operations department, she immediately sensed something was wrong. Conversations stopped abruptly around her. Two women near the printers glanced at each other before lowering their voices. A man from accounting stared openly for a second too long before pretending to check his phone. Emily's stomach tightened. She walked toward her desk carefully, trying to ignore the strange atmosphere around her. But whispers followed almost instantly. "That is her. I heard he drove there himself. At 3 in the morning? No way, this is only about a laptop." Emily froze mid-step. Her face went hot immediately. Somehow people already knew. She sat down quickly at her desk, pretending not to hear anything while panic slowly crawled up her spine. Across the office, two assistants whispered near the coffee station while glancing directly toward her. "I heard security saw his car outside her building. She is not even management." "Well, maybe she has other talents." Emily looked down at her computer screen so nobody would notice how much those words hurt. She had spent years working twice as hard to be taken seriously, and overnight everything was turning into gossip. Meanwhile, upstairs on the executive floor, Ethan sat silently at the head of a conference table while board members discussed quarterly projections around him. Normally, he dominated meetings with sharp focus and immediate decisions, but today his attention kept drifting unexpectedly, specifically toward one question. Had Emily made it to work on time after sleeping almost none at all? Ethan disliked distractions. He built his reputation on discipline and emotional distance. Yet sometime around 3 in the morning, inside a tiny apartment with flickering lights and a little girl asking impossible questions, something had quietly broken through the carefully controlled walls of his life. Then his assistant leaned closer and spoke carefully under her breath. Sir, there is already office chatter about last night. Ethan's expression hardened slightly. What kind of chatter? She hesitated. The kind that could become ugly very quickly. By lunchtime, the rumors had spread through nearly every department inside Blake Dynamics. Emily could feel the stares following her across hallways, elevators, and conference rooms no matter how hard she tried to focus on work. She kept her eyes locked on spreadsheets during meetings and answered questions as professionally as possible, but whispers still floated around her like smoke she could not escape. Some employees looked curious. Others looked judgmental. A few looked openly jealous. Emily had spent years building a reputation as someone reliable, quiet, and hardworking, and now people acted as though one late-night visit from the chief executive officer erased all of it overnight. Near the break room that afternoon, she overheard two women talking before they noticed she was standing nearby. I am just saying normal employees do not get personal deliveries from billionaires. Maybe she knows exactly what she is doing. Emily immediately turned and walked away before they could see the hurt in her face. Her chest tightened with humiliation as she returned to her desk. She wanted to disappear. Meanwhile, upstairs, Ethan sat inside his glass office staring out over downtown Chicago while his assistant finished updating him on the latest gossip spreading through the company. Human Resources already received 2 anonymous complaints this morning, she explained carefully. Complaints about what? Ethan asked coldly. Employees claiming favoritism. Ethan leaned back slowly in his chair, irritation darkening his expression. Because I returned a laptop? People are talking about the fact that you personally went to her apartment. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. He had spent years maintaining strict boundaries at work specifically to avoid situations like this. He never socialized with employees, never mixed personal attention with business. Yet somehow one simple act of kindness had turned into office entertainment overnight. His assistant hesitated before continuing. There is something else. Ethan looked up. Go on. Some board members heard the rumors too. They think it could become a distraction if it continues. Ethan let out a slow breath through his nose. Of course they did. The board only cared about perception, headlines, and stock prices. Human lives rarely mattered unless they affected quarterly earnings. But for the first time in years, Ethan found himself unexpectedly angry on someone else's behalf. Emily had done nothing wrong. She worked harder than half the executives in the building, yet now she was becoming a target simply because he chose to help her. Downstairs, Emily was trying to survive her afternoon presentation while pretending she could not feel every eye in the conference room watching her differently. Her hands remained steady only because she forced them to. The proposal itself went smoothly. Months of late nights and sacrifice showed clearly in the quality of her work. Even senior managers nodded approvingly during several sections. But the second the meeting ended, one executive casually smiled and said, "Looks like having the chief executive officer's attention really works out well for some people." Quiet laughter followed around the room. Emily felt her stomach drop instantly. She gathered her papers without responding and left the conference room as quickly as possible before anyone noticed her eyes watering. She locked herself inside a restroom stall 2 floors down and pressed one hand over her mouth, trying to steady her breathing. She was so tired. Tired of proving herself. Tired of struggling. Tired of pretending cruel comments did not hurt. Most of all, she was terrified that everything she worked for was collapsing because of one moment of kindness she never even asked for. At nearly the same time, Ethan received an unexpected message from one of the board directors requesting a private discussion before the end of the day. The message was short but clear. This situation with the employee needs to be addressed immediately. Ethan stared at the screen for several silent seconds before setting his phone down. Through the glass wall of his office, he could see hundreds of employees moving through the building below, like pieces inside a machine he created. For years, he believed control and distance were necessary to lead effectively. But now, for reasons he still did not fully understand, the idea of Emily standing alone downstairs while people tore apart her reputation made something inside him deeply uncomfortable. Then his office door opened again, and his assistant stepped inside, looking unusually tense. "Sir," she said carefully, "Emily Carter just submitted a request for unpaid leave effective immediately." The moment Ethan heard that Emily had requested unpaid leave, He stood from his desk so quickly that his assistant looked startled. "Did she say why?" he asked immediately. "No, sir. Human Resources only said she sounded upset." Ethan grabbed his suit jacket from the chair without another word. Half the executive floor watched silently as the chief executive officer walked through the building with unusual urgency, ignoring greetings and questions along the way. Downstairs, Emily was already packing the few personal items from her desk into a cardboard box while trying to keep her emotions under control. Sophie's crayon drawings disappeared carefully into one folder beside old coffee mugs and office supplies she had collected over the years. Around her, coworkers pretended not to stare, though she could still hear faint whispers drifting through the department. "I guess the attention finally backfired. I knew it would not last." Emily kept her head down. She was too exhausted to defend herself anymore. She only wanted to go home before she completely broke apart in front of everyone. Then suddenly the office fell strangely quiet. Emily looked up slowly and saw Ethan Blake walking directly through the operations department toward her desk. Every conversation stopped instantly. Even the printers seemed louder in the silence. Ethan reached her desk and looked at the cardboard box in her hands before meeting her eyes. "What are you doing?" Emily swallowed hard. "I requested leave." "I know." His voice remained calm, but there was tension beneath it now. "I asked why." Emily glanced nervously around at the dozens of employees openly watching them. "This is not really the place for this conversation." Ethan looked around the office once before making a decision that surprised everyone in the room, including himself. "Then let us have it somewhere more public." 20 minutes later, every employee inside Blake Dynamics received an emergency notification requiring attendance at an unscheduled company-wide meeting in the main conference auditorium. Hundreds of workers filled the room in confusion while executives exchanged nervous looks near the front rows. Emily stood near the side wall, clutching her box tightly, wishing she could disappear entirely. Then Ethan stepped onto the stage. The room became instantly silent. Ethan rarely addressed the full company unless something major had happened financially. But today there were no charts displayed behind him, no quarterly reports. Just him standing alone beneath the bright lights with one hand resting calmly against the podium. His eyes scanned the crowd briefly before he spoke. "This morning I became aware of rumors involving one of our employees and myself." The silence in the auditorium deepened immediately. Emily's heart pounded painfully in her chest. Ethan continued evenly. "Several people inside this company have chosen to create false narratives around a simple event. An employee accidentally left behind important work materials after staying in the office until nearly 2 in the morning. I returned those materials personally because I happened to be there when the situation occurred." He paused briefly. "That employee is Emily Carter." Hundreds of eyes instantly shifted toward her. Emily wanted the floor to swallow her whole. But Ethan's voice hardened slightly as he continued. "Emily Carter is one of the hardest working employees in this company. While many people here were asleep, she was still working to meet deadlines that benefited this organization. She has conducted herself with professionalism and integrity every single day." Several executives exchanged uncomfortable looks now. Ethan rarely defended anyone publicly. "If anyone should feel embarrassed by recent events," he said firmly, "it is not her." The room stayed completely still. Ethan then looked directly toward Emily across the auditorium. No employee at Blake Dynamics should ever feel punished for receiving basic human kindness. Emily felt tears burn her eyes instantly. Not because of the attention, because for the first time in a very long time, someone powerful had chosen to stand beside her instead of above her. Ethan stepped away from the podium without another word and walked directly toward the exit while stunned silence filled the auditorium behind him. Hours later, after the building finally emptied for the night, rain once again fell softly across Chicago streets as a familiar black Mercedes pulled into Emily's apartment parking lot. Sophie opened the apartment door before Emily even reached it. The little girl smiled immediately the second she saw Ethan standing there holding a paper bag from the small bakery down the street. "You came back," she said happily. Ethan looked past her toward Emily, standing quietly inside the apartment doorway. Then, for the first time in years, returning somewhere did not feel like obligation or routine. It felt like coming home.